Hi, everyone. I'm Monica Figueroa, Interim Librarian for Inclusive Excellence with the UNC University Libraries. And on behalf of the University Librarian, Elaine Westbrooks, and UNC Press's Spangler Family Director, John Shear, welcome this evening's presentation of Dr. Tyler D. Parry and his book, Jumping the Broom, The Surprising Multicultural Origins of a Black Wedding Ritual. Thank you for joining us for the fourth event in our virtual series, Off the Shelf, which is a co-production of the libraries and UNC Press to present new works published by the press that explore racial and social justice in our history and our world. This evening's event is being co-presented by UNC's Sonia Haynes Stone Center for Black Culture and History, and we thank them for their partnership. Over the next hour, I will be in conversation with Dr. Parry about his book. But before we begin, please note that the Q&A box is open for your questions, which we'll have time to moderate towards the end of our hour together. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to our guest today. Dr. Tyler D. Parry, Assistant Professor of African American and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and Senior Editor of Black Perspectives, is an expert on colonization of the Americas, the African diaspora, and the historical memory of slavery in the United States. Dr. Parry's research focuses on African American culture, the transatlantic slave trade throughout the Western Hemisphere, and the African American resistance and social movements. His work has been published in a variety of peer-reviewed journals, newspapers, and popular magazines, including the Journal of African American History, Past and Present, the Journal of Southern History, American Studies, Black Perspectives, and the Washington Post. In his newly published book, Jumping the Broom, The Surprising Multicultural Origins of a Black Wedding Ritual, Dr. Parry untangles the convoluted history of the broomstick wedding. Popularly associated with African American culture, Parry traces the ritual's origins to marginalized groups in the British Isles and explores how it influenced the marriage traditions of different communities on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Drawing from the historical records of enslaved peoples in the United States, British Romany, Louisiana Cajuns, and many others, Parry discloses how marginalized people found dignity in the face of oppression by innovating and reimagining marriage rituals. And telling the story of how disparate communities over the centuries reimagined this ritual in innovative ways, Parry reveals how the simple act of jumping the broom came to captivate so many who, on the surface, appear to have little in common with each other. So welcome, Tyler.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. I deeply appreciate the opportunity, and just wanted to thank University of North Carolina Press for making it happen, making all of our deadlines in the timely manner that they did, and for UNC Libraries hosting the event. I've always loved the area, and just happy to be here, even if it's just virtually.
Awesome. So to get us started this evening, I thought it might be nice to hear a little bit from you about your research trajectory, how you came to this work professionally, but also your personal connection to the research.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I think it requires holding up the book to demonstrate how great it feels to see it in existence. I mean, I guess I'll try to keep this relatively short because I do have a pretty deep attachment to the research and the ritual in general, in that I've been thinking about this project for over 10 years. Can trace it back to my own wedding and the wedding preparations that my wife and I did when we were much younger people. But the inception point truly of the project on a broader scale is my junior year, actually, at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, where I now teach. I'm actually an alumnus of the institution. I took a class called Comparative Slavery, and I chose the class initially because it worked within my schedule. That was the best thing. I was a student in Las Vegas that worked a lot, and so scheduling preferences were a premium for me. And so I took a class from a professor that I'd never heard of, I didn't know, but it ended up being the professor, Kevin Dawson, who became a mentor to me and remains a friend and a colleague. to this day. And the reason why I start here is because this was the first time I really felt that I was starting to understand the importance of slavery, not only as a historical process, but also the impact that it has in current society. And much of that has to do with the fact that it was the first time that I had been introduced to the idea that you can study slavery from the perspective of those enslaved. Prior to this, even with history classes in general, I was a very disinterested student, K through 12, simply because I always did well in history, but I always felt that it was the same narrative, kind of boring for me if we're talking about, the same people who just happen to be able to write things down, and that the narrative is framed strictly from their perspective.
Right.
But here within Dr. Dawson's class, I was learning about Olaudah Equiano, Venture Smith, a number of people from these early narratives. But I was also learning about slavery in Brazil, throughout the Atlantic Ocean. It introduced me to a much wider perspective and broader comparative perspective of how we could study enslaved people, but particularly the choices that they were making, and study them as people, not just as laborers. And so it completely reverted the narrative for me. And that really very much informed how I approached the original conception of this book.
Yeah.
So I won't give too much away so that people can, buy it and read it. But in my acknowledgement section, I do go over this story to where before my wife and I got married, the minister asked me to do some research on the tradition because there were going to be wedding guests that attended that wouldn't know what it was. And so he just wanted to give like a brief fact about it before we did the actual physical jump over the broom. And so long story short, the first attachment I had to this research was I deliver this report to him because I'm thinking research, paper, you must want 15 to 20 pages. And he looked at me wide-eyed, and basically it was one of those readings where he's like, he's not going to read it. He's thinking more like 5 to 6 sentences or something to that effect. But I did eventually sign a book for him and send it to him. So it's, the culmination of whether he wanted to read it or not. But I found so many fascinating things that just didn't seem to be widely available. I mean, I was reading reports from folklorists in the British Isles in like 1912. And I was thinking, there's got to be something more to this story. So I go to the scholarly literature. And the one thing that I find is that in the vast majority of secondary sources, jumping the broom is always referenced, but it's rarely analyzed. Yeah. Beyond just, just this kind of a quaint reference saying enslaved people sometimes jump the broom for marriage. But then I'm thinking, what else? Why? I mean, what is the point? Where does it come from? How did they come to it? And so I email Kevin Dawson because at that point I had been interested in going to graduate school. And I said, I found all of this stuff and I think it's unique because that's the main concern for a graduate student. What unique thing can I contribute to the literature? Really intimidating idea. And, him being a very supportive mentor essentially says, you've got something here. Just make sure you keep with it. Tell your advisor about it when you get to graduate school. My advisor, Daniel C. Littlefield, who also remains a good friend of mine, from the first day I submitted like this 20-page research paper, has been supportive of the project from the beginning. So I owe everything to the people that introduced me to the possibility of studying slavery from below and taking the choices of enslaved people seriously to really uncover their cultural practices.
Yeah. Thank you, Tyler, for sharing that.
Sure.
And this sort of goes into my next question that I have for you, and thinking about how you sort of like situate your work within this academic canon of, bringing to life enslaved histories. So in your writing, really, you bring these historical subjects to life. And my academic background includes substantial training and ethnography, and your historical writing resembles some of the anthropological writing that I've read in that regard. And so I wonder if you could situate your research for us in terms of your methodologies, your conceptual apparatus, or even disciplinary orientations, so that we have a clear understanding of how you conceived of this magnificent text.
Thank you for that. I'm so glad to hear you say that because I've, I've always wondered about how one acquires a methodology. And the
Yeah.
more that I speak to people about it, I start to just believe that people are kind of products of, the sources we engage with and the people we speak to. I was talking to a folklorist the other day, and he essentially said, you're already there. Why don't you just call yourself a folklorist? And I had no idea. I mean, I've, because I think with my entry into African American studies, I'm not seeing many disciplinary boundaries anymore.
Yeah.
And so I'm still a historian. I still engage with primary sources in the past. But, my approach is kind of, I alluded to earlier, is elevating the voices where they're available. And so one of my, I guess you'd say, requirements for when I started writing this book was that I wanted to make sure that the voices of the people I'm writing about are as elevated as possible.
Yeah.
Sometimes people accuse people who do that as, over quoting and, I'm not analyzing enough. You're just, having the sources speak without analysis. But I thought it was important, particularly not only for me, but just for the reader to see what it is, like how much information is actually out there. And so this is how I understand ethnographers, anthropologists, and folklorists is that they are very interested in the voices of their research subjects. And so I think I just reading all of these sources naturally acquired that as a historian, to where I was just so excited every time I found a source that mentioned jumping the broom, because
Yeah.
it's such a covert ritual that not many people spoke about. And, it really wasn't uncovered by many historians until the 1970s.
Wow.
It had, and I go into this a little bit in the historiography, but it had existed in kind of these variety of texts with the WPA narratives.
Yeah.
For those not familiar, it's essentially a series of formerly enslaved testimonials collected by the Federal Writers Program under FDR during the Great Depression. And so, incidentally, when they were interviewing rural people, they found a lot of Black Southerners who lived in the rural South that were once enslaved. And what you find within those is this largest scale collection of references to jumping the broom.
Right.
And the uniqueness was not lost on historians in the 70s who started investigating culture. Even George Rawick, who kind of catalogs all of these things in this massive 40-volume series, he even says in his introduction, he says, I have no idea where this comes from, but they keep talking about it. And so even then, as people were investigating the importance of the broomstick wedding to enslaved people, no one was entirely sure why. Because it didn't really have much attachment to other people as far as they could tell. And that's what motivated my research. But to get back to the original question, I think that along those lines,
Mm-hmm.
I was in my dissertation defense on a slightly different subject, and one of my committee members said, what you're claiming you're being original here, but that the Marxist scholars asked similar questions that you're asking beforehand. And he essentially said, are you attributing enough credit to the Marxist scholars that came before you? And he's thinking of Barbara Fields and Eugene Genovese when he was a Marxist. And, not Marxist in the economic sense, but one in which you're seeing kind of class consciousness and the relationships that marginalized people form both separately and together. And so that question, I think, lingered with me years later, even as I was writing this book, because if I'm writing about disenfranchised and ostracized communities, I do have to remain conscious as to how they were viewing these rituals themselves. The last thing I would want to do is analyze them to death to the point where I'm misrepresenting the meaning. And so ultimately what I conclude is that maybe there is no single conclusion for jumping the broom. It meant different things to different communities depending upon when and how they adopted it. So there is a unifying feature within all of these different groups jumping over the broom, but I have to open up the possibility that it certainly meant different things to each of them, even within the community, because there were many formerly enslaved people that rejected it. And they would even claim it never happened, interestingly enough. So I also had to deal with that aspect of, how does memory inform a person's perception of both their own past, but also the past of the collective? So on kind of a final point, maybe in a way to close like my approach and methodology, is I am always most interested in also demonstrating connections. And I think also with teaching African American studies, particularly in the disciplinary framework of African American studies for the past 7 years, I've become much more conscious about using the history of the past to inform the present.
Yeah.
So I could have written a book that stopped at 1865, and it
Right.
would have been fine. UNC Press may have still published it. But I think that the most important intervention was showcasing how deeply important the practice remained, even after it wasn't practiced for 100 years. It was always in the afterthoughts of the descendants of the people who used it. And then the interesting story is, how does it become revived and under what circumstances does it?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that, Tyler. The way that the way that you trace the ritual and the sort of malleability and flexibility that, it mutates, like it's, yeah, it's fascinating. I want to go back to one you were sort of talking about, sort of shame that maybe some formerly enslaved peoples felt with this ritual. So thinking about silence in the archive and the historical record. So here at Wilson Special Collections Library, we've been working really hard to surface marginalized voices and identities in the historical record. So naming enslaved peoples, marking whiteness, that sort of thing. In chapter 2, you discuss the broomstick wedding in the context of American enslavement. You were just talking about that and how formerly enslaved peoples oftentimes felt a sense of shame or embarrassment by their inability to legally marry, and would then subsequently not talk about it with the WPA interviewers. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the limitations of silence in the archives and what that means for piecing together histories.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is what I think causes me, particularly in my conclusion, to not be so dogmatic as to who is right or wrong, right? And this is important because, and I'm really informed by folklorists and anthropologists here, in that when you're talking about large swaths of people who have different personalities, people who are from different regions, people from different plantations,
Yeah.
you have to, as best as you possibly can, not speak of them in a generalized fashion. And so when this kind of intersects with the silence of the archive, is one thing that I decided to do was my best to read these statements deeply, because there are sources in which the only thing that it will give me is, we just jumped over the broomstick to get married.
Right.
That's it. So what does one do with that?
Right.
Now, there's a way, I think, through a close reading, and this is Levi-Strauss's kind of thick description idea with anthropology.
Yeah.
What do each one of those words mean? Why is it phrased that way? And then even more deeply, why is it recorded that way by the interviewer?
Right.
And so if a person says, we just jumped over the broomstick, to me, that evokes some sense of trying to dismiss it to some degree. Yeah. But also they felt it was important enough to reference, because at the same time, there were many people that didn't talk about their marriages at all. Or they would just say, well, I don't know, we didn't do anything, something like that, let's move on. But so on the one hand, we just jumped over the broomstick evokes this idea that it wasn't important, maybe, but they referenced that it still happened. So I was motivated, and this is, I think, what motivated me to do the quantified evidence that I normally don't do. But I felt that if I had, a collective of sources that spoke similarly under similar circumstances, I could make a case to try to see how often people discussed it and what that can reveal about the diversity under which it was used. And so one of the points that I think people might have some questions about is, I found that in the broad scale of things, jumping the broom as an individual marriage ritual was actually in the numerical minority of what people did. And that actually shocked a lot of my initial readers, because one thing the secondary literature tries to make relatively clear is that this was the most used ritual, when in fact it doesn't seem to be the case.
Right.
I argue that that doesn't make it any less significant, but it is at least a reference of nuance that we have to deal with, to where this would require us then to determine, well, why didn't everybody jump the broom? I mean, and part of that is because it depends on whether or not they even knew about it. because another silence of the archive is some people directly say expressly, we did not jump over the broom on my plantation. We got married in a church wedding with a minister and guests, and everybody was there. And they felt the need to emphatically reject the importance of the broomstick wedding. Now, in the past, this caused some people to deny the value and the validity of it. Once again, kind of employing this problematic, generalized narrative of using one person to talk about how everybody else thought. So I felt it was kind of important to take my time and sift through all of these narratives. And even, a 5-word statement became really important for kind of fleshing out some of these more hidden gems of which how I could interpret the broomstick wedding's broader impact. And even, detached from just the experience of enslaved people, this was a problem pretty much with every community. And one statement I make within the chapter when I'm talking about disenfranchised white populations
Yeah.
is they actually didn't really speak much about it at all because most of them didn't actually write anything down. And
Right.
so what I'm working with is this top-down assumption about people's cultural practices. And so then I had to even read between the lines even more and kind of filter through the stereotypes and the generalizations placed upon them to determine the value that it may have held within their cultural practices as well. And so this was one of the things, and maybe what took so long for the book to get done, was this challenge of trying to accurately represent to my own satisfaction that I was appropriately analyzing the text that I was working with.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, thank you. And books take a long time to finish, so I don't think that you should worry about that. Um, I wonder if we could talk a little bit about this historical narrative. So you throughout the book you chart this fascinating historical narrative about this ritual, placing its origins in the British Isles, mostly among subaltern people. Um, but this ritual, marrying over the broom, jumping the broom, like you said, you had to sort of like read between the lines in this text. It took multiple forms depending upon the cultures involved. Um, I wonder, could we talk a little? You go into this in the book, and maybe you can give a few examples. But can we talk a little bit about the variations um, and the strong connections to brooms and broomsticks? I was really fascinated by that. And also this like superstition factor associated with brooms safeguarding homes against sorcery and witches.
Yeah, and this was probably the most interesting aspect of the research for me because I am interested in culture and that
Yes.
is, and the choices and decisions that people make. And so this was actually probably the first area that I started exploring when I got interested in the project. And because I'm talking about folklore a lot or folk testimonies, one of the difficulties I had in kind of convincing historians of the importance of the topic is there's always this interest in, point A to point B, like when does the cultural ritual transfer from
Yeah.
one group to the other, right? And that
Yeah.
was very hard to do.
Yeah.
And essentially I found one source that provides a possibility for how it was, but it was a novel written in the 18th century
Right.
that really became a key connective feature of the transatlantic dimensions of the ritual. But in absence of a lot of that evidence, what I felt that I had to do was compare the methods of ritual performance across the entire group spectrum. So that includes connecting the rituals of British Romani with those of rural Welsh communities in North Wales,
Yeah.
with those of, even Irish travelers, to Louisiana Cajuns,
Right.
Appalachians, and even people in the American West as well, and enslaved people. And what I found is that there are some commonalities, but some very key distinctions that are important to reference. So as far as examples, some commonalities that I thought were really interesting was in certain cases, and once again, this is subjective to individuals' regional or personal circumstances, There were methods under which the ritual was performed that seemed to provide a connective fabric that unites a lot of these communities together. So on the one hand, in North Wales, within a particular community, it was known that they would set the broom on the doorstep. And I provide an image that was kindly allowed to be reprinted by, I think, the Journal of Folklore. And but interestingly enough, after that ceremony is confirmed, the couple has a year to initiate a divorce if they choose to. And the woman could actually choose to do so. So it wasn't just a man who determined the divorce, but that the woman within this community was able to do so. And basically what that required was a complete reversal of the custom. So jumping backwards over the broom. And so I was curious, I'm like, does this happen anywhere else?
Right.
And I found multiple examples amongst different groups of people, but specifically testimonials from formerly enslaved people where they would talk about divorce.
Right.
And divorce amongst enslaved people, I think, is probably an understudied subject because the vast majority of people who separated were separated forcibly. But some people did decide through their own agency to initiate a divorce. And I found in two instances, two different people separated by 1,000 miles from each other saying the exact same thing, that if you wanted to get divorced on their plantation, you just jumped over backwards.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, even if I didn't have that source in the 18th century, I assume this is enough, that there would at least be some evidence for a transatlantic connection between these two formerly enslaved people and that community in Northern Wales. My assumption is they have no idea each other exists. And then as I went further into the American West, I found within this mining community in Colorado that one of the methods of divorce there was a backwards jump over the broomstick. And so you see kind of this movement from the Atlantic into the southern states and then clear into the American West during westward expansion in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So those similarities, I think, were really important for trying to piece together this transatlantic framework that I was arguing for. It couldn't just be people jumping over a broomstick in kind of this generic fashion, but I wanted to see if the specific ritual processes ever bore this out.
Yeah.
One thing I would say for enslaved people, though, is they seem to have had the most diverse collection of different ritual practices regarding jumping the broom. And I drew heavily from the literature on enslaved cultures within this particular analysis, because thanks to the historians that came before me, we now know how dynamic enslaved people were at adopting and adapting different cultural rituals that they would then place value upon to various degrees. And so jumping the broom, I argue, despite its European origins, becomes very much something associated with enslaved people and African Americans more broadly because of how embedded it is in this particular cultural framework in the 19th century.
Yeah.
And so within the supernatural aspect, this is where I think I made a pretty important contribution in kind of my own estimation, because as I was writing about jumping the broom, I was thinking, something is missing within this analysis. And what was really missing was, how did people think about broomsticks?
Right.
Is there a history of broomsticks to be written? And, you know, when I say that to the broader public, they think that's kind of funny, like a history of broomsticks. But for scholars, they're thinking, well, yeah, certainly there has to be a history of broomsticks. I mean, nearly every culture in the world has had some form of a broomstick for sweeping. And so we have to assume that as a tool for cleanliness, it has significant cultural and social value.
Right.
And so within the supernatural elements, one thing I found that was consistent, this may have been an inheritance of more medieval European ideas associated with witchcraft and the supernatural phallic aspects of broomsticks,
Yeah.
is that certainly within the Welsh resources and more of the Celtic resources, they seem to have a definitive association with ideas of broomsticks representing at least a rite of passage for married couples. And much of this had to do with the woman's worthiness for getting married. So a successful jump over the broom suggested that you were both able to enter in domestic life unscathed and free of the burden of malevolent forces that might follow you.
Right.
This becomes very expressed, particularly amongst white Appalachian communities. And they actually have a really strong collection of folklore associated with this idea that, if you don't want ghosts to enter your house, place a broomstick in front of the porch or in front of the doorway, and they're just barred from entry. Like there's a supernatural blockade. And to be very honest with you, my wife and I still salt the new residents of every place that we move to, just because that's kind of a carryover tradition associated with a number of different people. And so I could kind of relate to this idea as to how people acquire these messages. But then when I went into the enslaved population, I wanted to see, okay, what did a broomstick mean to a person beyond just this tool that somebody jumped over? I mean, it has to have a broader meaning.
Yeah.
And what I essentially found was that broom makers, and even Frederick Douglass talks about this, which I was really happy to find, is that they were incredibly valued within the community. Like their skills of curing whatever they made it, there was broom or hay or broom corn sometimes what was talked about, or straw, that their skills in constructing good solid brooms were greatly valued, not only within the plantation, but also outside of it. I mean, these broomsticks they created could actually sell for money. This was considered a skilled form of labor. And it's interesting because if you think about how they were making them, they were probably picking up things that existed on the plantation already. So they're creating a meaningful tool for both cleanliness, but also what would eventually become, entry into the domestic state. So attached to that, you start to see enslaved people, or formerly enslaved people specifically, associate the broomsticks in kind of similar ways that would reflect European folklore. And so the intervention I think I make there, and this follows some previous analyses about the ways in which enslaved people, free blacks, and poor white communities can have this underground network in which they engaged with one another. I make this entry point to say there also seems to be some sharing of folkloric knowledge occurring at this point, because we see these similarities not just in the practice of jumping the broom, but the very conception of what the broom stands for within the community. So this attachment to ghost lore and witchcraft, and this notion that you had to protect the broom and preserve it. And it was even a gift given by the community as well, that makes it even more meaningful. It wasn't just something you jumped over and tossed aside, but you likely preserved it. And it was a consistent reminder of your commitment to one another, particularly amongst groups of people who had very little material items.
Yeah. It's fascinating. I really loved reading your discussion of brooms and their meaning to different, communities. And I think that this sort of goes into my next question for you, and it's talking about the heritage broom and the revival of broomstick weddings amongst African Americans, sort of in the 1960s, 1970s, and going into the 90s. So you discuss Black American heritage and civil rights and Black power, and you touch on Alex Haley's Roots, the saga of an American family, and its subsequent television miniseries. You talk about Margaret Walker's Jubilee, among other written and visual depictions of the broomstick ceremony in Black America. And you go into the rise of African American heritage weddings and the marketing of these heritage brooms. You write, I have a quote, I'm pulling out your book for everyone to see. So you write, the heritage broom provided a way for the diaspora to connect itself with the continent, even if its African roots were questionable. And I wonder if I feel like we would be remiss not to talk about this, to talk about Black cultural value and sort of ownership of broomstick ceremonies, and the significance of locating the origins of the ceremony that is so intimately connected to Black Americans elsewhere.
Yeah, this is a great question. And please feel free to ask follow-ups if I seem to miss something, because within this broader context, I think that another motivation I had for bringing the book to the present was to at least engage with these questions to
Right.
the degree that I could, and then open it up for others to follow along the analysis if they agree or disagree. And so one thing that I was trying to do with this particular moment was to provide some clarification for how the broomstick wedding becomes reintegrated into African American consciousness. And I certainly analyze Roots' significance within the broader context of it, but I suggest that Roots built along the work of Margaret Walker.
Right.
It was very much reliant upon Ebony and Jet as well for publicity when they also started writing about the broomstick wedding, and really kind of this assertion of the Black creative arts in the 1970s, which, Roots was certainly a product of. And, Roots is different only in the sense, I would argue, that it had a television miniseries that became immensely popular.
Yeah.
And the thing that occurs, which is why it's important to reference this, is if you read Roots, you actually get the sense that Haley was being far more nuanced than he might be given credit for when talking about the broomstick wedding, because he actually makes the case that this is something Kunta Kinte didn't want to do,
Right.
because he did not see any African origins behind it. And so Haley, if you read his transcripts and his archives, he actually talks about the ways under which he understood jumping the broom, and that really he discovered the practice through oral history from his grandmother, but also through reading the narratives of formerly enslaved people. And within Roots, he kind of actually makes this case that this was a much more complex ritual than if you only watch the miniseries. Really, all you get from the miniseries is Kunta Kinte and Belle have this conversation about getting married the night before. And then I think it's the next day on the plantation, everybody's gathered and they just jump over the broom after it's pronounced by the elder to do so. So there's nothing stated about the broomstick. And so for people viewing the miniseries without reading the book, it might just be assumed this is something that enslaved people did. And because Kunta Kinte has African heritage, that maybe there's some African origins to it.
Right.
So within this entire process, there's also this rise of Afrocentrism in which Black Americans start to reject kind of a Eurocentric curriculum and try to tell their own stories based upon these kind of Africanized African concepts. Now, what this does for jumping the broom is, because there is a lack of, historical primary sources that have been uncovered that really went through a lot of the details surrounding it, you have this rise of the heritage wedding, which is designed to integrate aspects of one's African heritage, but also enslaved heritage within what you would call a traditional white wedding. And, white wedding just conveys this idea of like the Victorian era of the white wedding dress. But within the context of the 1990s, you're talking a wedding industrial complex. So billions of dollar industry, middle-class people are investing a lot of money, and that includes the Black middle class, to make sure their weddings are very elaborate and ornate. But within African-American heritage weddings, certainly there's getting married in the church under the Christian tradition, but ensuring that your ancestral past is also represented beyond just the Christian ceremony. So you would see things draped in kente cloth, you would see libations awaiting to be offered, you would probably have some sort of either African ethnic food served or food that's associated with African American culinary history. And then you would have jumping the broom included within that. Now, there are some sources where you actually see the broomstick wrapped in kente cloth as kind of a signification that this ritual goes beyond the conventional white American Christian ideas surrounding a church wedding.
Right.
But what this causes is, as with anything, and you talked about the marketing of the broomstick wedding. As with most things, as this becomes more and more integrated into Black American wedding ceremonies, and you can trace this really back to the 80s, in kind of the post-Roots era, where particularly Ebony and Jet magazine are reporting upon wide scale, and the Los Angeles Sentinel, I should say too, so Black newspapers and magazines, they're reporting upon some noteworthy weddings that are occurring amongst Black Americans, and they
Mhm.
will reference that they jumped the broom. And so one of the suggestions I make is gradually you start to see more and more people introduced to this. So if you have like a 400-person wedding ceremony,
Right.
400 people are seeing you jump over a broomstick, and then 400 people are probably going to ask the question, what is this? Where
Right.
does it come from? And so what that leads to is, with particularly in the 1990s, you have heritage wedding planners
Yeah.
becoming elevated within the Black American wedding scene, and they're writing books about what it means to marry as a Black American, what type of cultural reference points should you have, a mixture of African and American experiences. And Harriet Cole, who was a writer for Essence magazine at the time, writes really the quintessential wedding planner, um, and it entitles it Jumping the Broom.
Right.
And within it, actually the history behind Jumping the Broom is actually relatively minimal within the book, but the suggestions that she makes about the possible origin points of the wedding essentially just take off.
Right.
And there's another named Danita Roundtree Green, who also releases a wedding planner where she takes a little bit further and essentially says there is some evidence that African descended people did this first. And so, attached to that, with Cole's hypothesis about the importance of broomsticks within West African societies, and then the rise of the internet a little bit later, you actually have a relative explosion of ideas behind the African origins of jumping the broom. And because European folklorists had not really promoted their research at this point, because there were some academic journal articles about jumping the broom, but academic journals sometimes are not read by the wider population. Um, Essentially, people who investigated popular culture and the history behind rituals were the ones kind of setting the tone for how it was being interpreted. So for a couple of decades, really, maybe even more, because there's still a lot of people who believe Jumping the Broom's African origins, that really takes hold. And with the reference points of roots is this kind of this tome that really gives African Americans a sense of their cultural heritage, one that extends beyond the United States in particular. You actually have this combination of people who believe that to dignify one's ancestors, particularly beyond slavery to some degree, you jump over the broom.
Right.
And there seems to have been a real legitimate excitement surrounding that idea. Now, some Afrocentric scholars reject it. They claim there are no African origins to it. It's a ridiculous thing to do. But I argue that was also kind of problematic because it seems to have been rejected on the basis that it was associated with slavery. And
Mm.
so to do so meant that you were propping up the narrative of slavery and downplaying the African past.
Yeah.
But my intervention, I would say, particularly in the chapter being referenced, but also the conclusion, is I don't think that something has to be from Africa to make it authentically African American or an authentic cultural tradition amongst people. And so, to some degree, within these parameters of cultural appropriation, I do make an argument that in this case, there might be a way to transcend kind of that limited scope of trying to determine who owns a ritual. And ultimately, I conclude that the narrative of cultural ownership might be the wrong trajectory for trying to decipher the importance that the ritual holds amongst the many groups that used it. Just because the first reference we have is perhaps amongst Welsh communities in the mid 19th century doesn't make it any less attached to the cultures of enslaved people. Because ultimately, what matters is how do people adapt to it? How do they envision it once they adopt it? And I think that this is largely positioned within the broader narrative of African American history. I think particularly of culinary traditions amongst enslaved people. I mean, this idea that the pig becomes a staple amongst enslaved people, and they find ways to make something delicious out of an animal that's largely rejected by the society. The same thing with the broomstick wedding operates in that it was a ritual rejected by so-called elites, but particularly by slave owners. And so the question then becomes, well, I should say the statement is, I'm not concerned with what slave owners thought about the ritual in the case of how it informs my conception of what enslaved people did. I am most interested in how enslaved people felt about it and what they did with it and the circumstances under which it was rejected or embraced within the historical moment.
Thank you, Tyler. I really, that question that you asked in your conclusion, you know, is the question, do we ask who owns this ritual? No, right? Like you go into, we should be looking at cultural transmission and adaptation and, exchange, right?
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think that one of the other things that was a roadblock for many people, particularly, even with my own personal conversations with people. So the first question I would typically get when people found out I was writing about this is, where does it come from?
Yeah.
And I could see when my conversations and my answer that some people were deeply disappointed that it was a European ritual.
Yeah.
Because there was this idea that to make it truly valid or valuable, that there had to be some African origins beyond enslavement for it to be something that they wanted to pay respect to. But when you read the cultural histories of people who were writing in the 1970s and beyond,
Yeah.
basically we have to determine that enslaved people created things of beauty that
Right.
were largely rejected by the broader society, and that legacy continued into their descendants, all the way into the present era. And so I see jumping the broom, the wedding tradition, as a part of that narrative, that the innovations and the creativity that people employed when they were using is something that can be very valuable for people in the modern era too. And so that was also a motivation to write the book and to elevate the voices of enslaved people, because I wanted to showcase that this is not just a simple step over a broomstick,
Right.
but that there were these very ornate, elaborate, ritualized, formatted structures under which people used it. And to pay true respect to it, we have to pay attention to those steps that people were doing. And so I start the book with a vignette that portrays a very elaborate ritual that two people engaged in. And then I essentially ask the questions, what does this possibly mean as a legacy that two people were utilizing? And then for the person that told the story, what seems to be the meaning for them? And ultimately I conclude that there was something of value being established here, and that it is our responsibility to take these narratives seriously.
Yeah. Thanks, Tyler. I want to remind the audience that the Q&A box is open, so please do submit any questions that you have for Tyler. While we wait for, I see a question here. So we have a question from Elaine Westbrooks, our university librarian. Were there other rituals that you stumbled upon that are really interesting and deserve more research? Maybe the topic of your next book.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Yeah. So this is a good question, because I guess one thing I would argue is that as an individual ritual, jumping the broom is the most documented. So I would say, and probably argue, that it has the most impact amongst enslaved people within the US South. For whatever reason, I actually don't know why, except for the fact that it was just so broadly used by so many people that it seems obvious that that might occur. I stumbled upon a few different sources, but I ultimately concluded in the text that I just didn't have enough evidence to really explore them, though that could change depending on what I find later. There were some people who talked about getting married under a blanket, and that seems very unique to that particular section. As I actually talked to some scholars of Indigenous American history, they suggested that there's probably some links to what Indigenous people were doing within the Southeast and other areas. And that actually made a lot of sense to me. So I looked up briefly blanket weddings, and it does seem that whatever this particular couple was doing was probably influenced by some of the cultural practices of the surrounding communities upon which existed at that area. There were also different elements of marriage processes that had to do with, little tokens that were given to people. And actually, in my dissertation, which at some point will become a book,
Yeah.
once I'm ready to get back into the writing process with that one, I was interested in what enslaved people did before jumping the broom becomes kind of the main cultural reference point of the 19th century.
Right.
Because one thing I argue, that I maybe should have mentioned before, is that jumping the broom only really seems to happen in the 1800s. There may be some evidence of it happening before then, but you don't really see a significant expression of the ritual, as far as we can tell, until about 1810s. A lot of this might have to do with the increasing emphasis upon reproduction amongst the enslaved community because the transatlantic slave trade had closed. There was also an invasion of enslaved people's private lives by slave owners because at this point, also, they were trying to portray themselves as benevolent paternalists to encourage their enslaved people to get married. And so wedding ceremonies were a main cultural reference point for those who were mounting apologetics for slavery. So you start to see a much greater presence of slaveholders in the marriages of 19th century enslaved people, whereas in the 18th century, you really don't have that. It seems, from what we could tell, slave owners were more willing to basically leave it up to the enslaved people to determine it. And what I found, that I'm going to try to build upon, and this largely is following Tara Hunter's work, Bound in Wedlock, where she investigates the colonial period. I found one where an enslaved man gives a woman a brass ring. Now, that might seem insignificant on the surface without the context of the broader African diaspora. What I was able to piece together in my dissertation, that I hope to expand upon later, was if you look at the circumstances under which this brass ring was offered, it actually resembles the courtship rituals of West African societies, where these brass manillas were offered to women or their families as kind of a form of currency,
Right.
to use the bride wealth as a way to accept or reject a person's proposal for marriage. And so, to the best of their ability, one argument I make is that enslaved people in the colonial Americas, but mainly North America, were trying in ways that they could to resemble their ancestral cultural traditions. But then there's this turning point in the 19th century where you don't see that as much, and you start to see some form of a European cultural tradition being used by enslaved people. But I argue only within the circumstances that enslaved people did so. I mean, I argue that the different expressions that were used within the wedding are very much invested in a unique cultural form developed by enslaved people.
Yeah. Thanks, Tyler. We have one last question, and we have an audience member who would love to hear more about the Welsh and Wales background. So, did Welsh bring enslaved people to the New World? Did Welsh immigrants in the colonies eagerly embrace enslaved labor? Could many afford enslaved laborers? And did you, in your research process, did you run into any Welsh Quakers?
Wow, good questions. So I will start out by saying that there is some great research being done amongst scholars in Wales that is trying to determine the extent to which Wales participated in the slave trade. Because for a very long time, the English were largely just blamed for the whole thing. And, to some degree, that's fair because it was, the port cities in England were vibrant within the slave trade era. But scholars in Scotland and Wales are now trying to analyze the degree to which others within Britain also engaged in slave trade. So the answer is yes, there were Welsh slave owners within the US South, and particularly you see them within South Carolina. But one thing you also see is a lot of Welsh people came as indentured servants. And those interactions are important in the early periods between Welsh people who were also in a state of bonded labor and chattel slaves who were always of African descent. And if you look at some of the memoirs published by formerly enslaved people, they talk about these interactions. They talk about even mutual forms of resistance that they engaged in. But
Right.
you also see some evidences that, within this broader transatlantic world, there's even one case I found where a young man of African descent learned Welsh because he was around so many Welsh people. And so that's an instance of cultural exchange that I think bears some evidence that even if there weren't Welsh slave owners introducing this custom to people, and also we're largely talking about marginalized populations. So Welsh slave owners either wouldn't have done it or they would have introduced it under the motivations for mockery amongst the enslaved community. But what seems to have happened is, two origin points. On the one hand, slave owners certainly introduced it under those
Mhm.
circumstances, but also there's evidence of cultural exchange between poor whites and enslaved people that even if I can't pinpoint directly when it happens, there are some suggestions in the narratives that it happened, and that jumping the broom and marriage traditions across the British Isles, but also the African diaspora, occurred within these spaces throughout the US South.
Yeah.
And I think I forgot the last part of the question if I didn't answer it.
Um, Welsh Quakers. Did you run
Oh, well,
into an? Yeah.
not in the period I was studying.
Yeah.
So you probably would find the Welsh Quakers in the 17th century
Yeah.
more so. But for my research, I didn't run into any. But also, I should say it's because I wasn't really looking. So certainly they probably existed. But there were some pretty important majority Welsh churches throughout the U.S. South that talk about enslaved people who attended, either through their own volition or attached to the slave owners that attended the church.
Yeah. We have one last question, if we can get through it. So, we have an audience member who would like to hear more of the cultural or geographic overlaps you uncovered related to rituals. So, similar to what you were talking about with the indigenous blanket tradition.
Yeah. Okay. So cultural and geographical overlap. So, I mean, on the one hand, and I guess what we're talking about here is when we're trying to piece together kind of disparate communities, right? When you're talking about Appalachian communities, which
Mhm.
also had African Americans, but were predominantly white in the era. These are very isolated groups. And so, what I find kind of interesting about cultural adaptation and cultural exchange is I have to be very imaginative here as to how this happens. On the one hand, the most obvious answer is that at some unknown point, but there is evidence that it happened in the 18th century, um, some Welsh sailor or somebody, maybe a London dock worker or something that was on a ship, lands in some part of the Americas, but specifically within the United States, and jumps over a broomstick for marriage. And then that perhaps is acquired under certain circumstances by people who are outside of that cultural group. But one thing that becomes clear when we start to chart it within the more modern, like 20th century, is that people are directly influenced by guests within their either their home country or their region or their specific residence. So you start to actually see people in the late 90s and early 2000s in Jamaica jumping the broomstick. People argue largely because of an increased tourism amongst African Americans who are doing what you might call a combination of a heritage wedding and a destination wedding.
Right.
So destination weddings being you go to an elaborate tropical place to get married, and then you use your own cultural rituals from your background at home. And people watching this become invested in it. They find it interesting. And I make this argument that because of Pan-Africanism, there's this idea of cultural similarity across the diaspora. So in some circumstances, you actually see Jamaicans embracing the ritual under the idea that it's an African ritual.
Yeah.
So I have to assume that similar things occurred within the 19th century. It's just that I don't have documents where there's actual conversations being exchanged. So there is one thing that I use, one short statement, again, going back to the silence in the archives question,
Mhm.
where a formerly enslaved man in North Carolina is asked about it by the interviewer. And he says, I think he says, we just jumped the broomstick. But then he qualifies it and he says, but the poor white folks did the same thing, just as kind of a way to make sure that the interviewer knew this wasn't just unique to him and his community, but another population, white people, also used it under certain circumstances. But that's all he says. And so I had to kind of unpack the layers under which these processes may have occurred, with the absence of the actual evidence that tells me everything I need to know. And so the geographical distribution is wide. I mean, this goes all the way to the Pacific side of the United States, upwards into New York City, down into the Louisiana bayous, and then over into South Carolina and the Deep South. And then later on, it goes to other parts of the diaspora. And then I make the argument in a brief section called "Do White People Still Jump the Broom?" that this notion of rejection of kind of the Christian standard and this embrace of neo-pagan ideas, usually associated with Wiccan communities, you start to see jumping the broom occurring in a lot of places amongst people of European descent, but specifically in like Australia, and then in Ireland and Scotland. And a lot of this has to do with the toppling down of restrictive laws that banned people from using pagan ceremonies. And so once things are opened up to people, you start to actually see a full-scale embrace of it. And so the best answer I can provide is that this analysis went from being Southern to transatlantic to nearly global. And the circumstances under which people exchange culture is a piece of that process. But I had to be imaginative in trying to peel back those layers.
Yeah. Thank you, Tyler. It's an absolutely wonderful book. So thank you so much for sharing your work and for having such an insightful conversation about it. I also want to thank my libraries and press colleagues, especially Katie Fanfani and Nadia Clifton and Ali Shea, for everything they do to make possible the Off the Shelf series. And thanks to you all in the audience for joining us today. Don't forget to visit uncpress.org to use your 40% discount to buy these books. The Off the Shelf series continues in the new year, so please look out for a forthcoming announcement about our spring lineup. And we hope to see you again soon. Thank you, Tyler.